It is a few minutes past 07:25 on June 6, 1944, and a squat, ungainly tank is grinding up the sand at Sword Beach, trailing a spinning drum of chains that thrash the ground ahead of it like a farmer threshing wheat, except that what this machine is threshing is a minefield. Behind it, close enough to walk in its tracks, infantrymen of the British 3rd Division advance in single file, trusting their lives to a corridor of cleared sand no wider than the tank itself. Somewhere ahead, a second machine, squat and turretless, lumbers toward a concrete strongpoint and fires a mortar bomb the size of a dustbin lid, a weapon so unusual that German defenders who survived the war will later describe it, in interrogation, as something closer to witchcraft than engineering. These machines have no official nickname among the men who built them, but the soldiers advancing behind them, and eventually the historians who write about them, will come to know them collectively as Hobart's Funnies, and on this particular stretch of Normandy coastline, they are, in the most literal sense, the difference between a beach that is taken and a beach that is not. Why did an armored division built around oddly modified tanks matter enough to shape the outcome of an entire invasion beach? The answer begins 18 months earlier, in the aftermath of a raid that had gone catastrophically wrong. In August 1942, Allied forces had launched a large-scale raid against the French port of Dieppe, testing the concept of an opposed amphibious landing against a defended coastline. The result was a disaster. Of roughly 6,000 men who took part, well over half became casualties, and Allied tanks landed on the shingle beach found themselves unable to move, their tracks unable to grip the loose stones, leaving them stranded as static targets for German gunners rather than mobile support for the infantry they were meant to protect. Dieppe demonstrated, at brutal cost, a problem that planners could no longer avoid confronting. Conventional tanks, designed for open continental battlefields, were simply not built to cross a defended beach, negotiate obstacles, breach concrete fortifications or clear minefields under fire, and infantry sent ashore without that support paid for the gap with their lives. The scale of what needed solving became clearer as intelligence on the Atlantic Wall accumulated through 1943. German coastal defenses along the likely invasion beaches combined layered minefields, anti-tank ditches, concrete pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, thick belts of barbed wire, and steel or concrete obstacles designed specifically to disable landing craft and immobilize vehicles attempting to cross the sand. Naval and aerial bombardment, however heavy, could not be relied upon to clear a reliable path through this layered defense, as the Dieppe raid, and later, painfully, the American experience at Omaha Beach would both confirm. What the invasion needed was not simply more tanks, but tanks redesigned from the ground up for a single beach crossing, tanks that could breach walls, cross ditches, detonate mines ahead of the infantry rather than beneath their boots, and do all of this while still under direct enemy fire. No existing vehicle in the British or American inventory in 1943 could do any of this reliably, let alone all of it together. The man given responsibility for solving this problem was Major General Percy Hobart, a controversial and famously blunt armored warfare specialist who had been effectively sidelined earlier in the war after clashing with more conventionally minded superiors, before being recalled specifically to build and command the newly formed 79th Armored Division. Hobart's task was not to design a single weapon, but to assemble an entire toolkit of specialized armor, working from the modified Churchill and Sherman tank chassis already in British production, and adapting each one to solve a specific, narrowly defined problem that would otherwise have cost infantry lives to solve by hand. The mine-clearing vehicle that led the advance up Sword Beach was the Sherman Crab, a standard Sherman tank fitted with a rotating drum mounted on arms projecting forward of the hull, from which lengths of heavy chain, each weighing several kilograms, were attached and spun at speed by a separate engine connected to the drum. As the tank advanced, the spinning chains thrashed the ground ahead of it with enough force to detonate buried mines before the tank's own tracks reached them, clearing a path roughly the width of the tank itself, marked at the edges with dye or tape so that following infantry and vehicles knew precisely where it was safe to walk. The sound, by surviving accounts, was closer to a threshing machine or road drill than anything recognizably military. A continuous, violent clattering audible over gunfire, and the dust and debris thrown up by the flailing chains often reduced visibility for the crew to almost nothing, meaning crab operators frequently drove partially blind through an active minefield while under direct fire, trusting their navigation to compass headings and prior briefings rather than what they could actually see through the vision slits. Working alongside the crabs was the Churchill AVRE, an armored vehicle Royal Engineers built on a Churchill tank hull with its main gun replaced by a short-barreled spigot mortar known as the petard, capable of firing a 40-pound demolition charge, a projectile nicknamed the flying dustbin for its shape and size, at ranges up to roughly 80 meters, sufficient to crack open a concrete bunker wall that would have shrugged off a conventional tank shell. The AVRE could also be fitted with a variety of specialized attachments depending on the obstacle it needed to solve. A bundle of logs, called a fascine, carried on the front of the hull and dropped into anti-tank ditches to create a crossable ramp, a bobbin device that unrolled a continuous canvas and steel matting carpet across soft clay or sand too weak to support vehicle weight, or a small box girder bridge, carried and laid directly by the tank itself, capable of spanning a gap several meters wide in a matter of minutes rather than the hours conventional bridging would require under fire. Each variant existed because a specific obstacle, catalogued and studied in painstaking detail by planners working from aerial photography and intelligence reports, needed a specific solution, and Hobart's engineers built precisely that solution rather than expecting a single general-purpose vehicle to manage everything. Production of these vehicles took place primarily at converted engineering works across the British Midlands, drawing on existing Churchill and Sherman manufacturing lines already established for standard tank production, with the specialized fittings, drums, mortars, and bridging equipment manufactured separately and fitted before deployment. Exact production figures for each variant remain difficult to state with complete precision, since wartime records for specialized low-volume conversions were not always kept with the same rigor as mainstream tank production, though several hundred vehicles across the various Funnies types were available by the time of the invasion, distributed across the beaches according to the specific obstacles each sector was expected to face. At Sword Beach, specifically, the Funnies performed close to what their designers had intended, and the beach, while still costly and dangerous, avoided the catastrophic stall that gripped Omaha several hours to the west. Crabs cleared lanes through minefields ahead of the first infantry waves. AVRs breached seawalls and cleared obstacles that would otherwise have channeled troops into predictable killing zones, and specialized bridging variants allowed vehicles to cross drainage ditches and anti-tank obstacles that had been specifically cited to halt exactly this kind of advance. Losses among the Funnies' crews were nonetheless real. Several AVREs and crabs were destroyed by German anti-tank guns and mines during the advance, and crews operating vehicles with reduced visibility, limited traverse, or slower speed than conventional tanks accepted a level of exposure to enemy fire that more mobile armor could often avoid. If you are finding this level of detail useful, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories properly. The comparison with Omaha Beach, where American forces landed without access to most of Hobart's specialized armor, is instructive, though it needs to be drawn carefully rather than presented as a simple cause and effect explanation for everything that went differently between the two beaches. American commanders had been offered the use of Funnies variants before the invasion and had declined most of them, in part due to logistical and integration concerns, retaining only the duplex drive swimming tanks in a configuration broadly similar to the British approach. Those DD tanks, launched too far offshore in rough seas, sank in large numbers before reaching Omaha's sand, leaving the beach without the armored support British and Canadian forces enjoyed at Sword, Juno, and Gold. It would be an oversimplification to claim that Funnies alone explain why Omaha struggled so severely while Sword did not, since terrain, the unexpected presence of a stronger German division, and failures in preliminary bombardment all contributed independently to Omaha's difficulties. What can be said with more confidence is that the specialized armor available to British and Canadian forces solved specific, previously lethal problems, minefields, seawalls, anti-tank ditches, that American forces at Omaha were instead forced to solve the hard way, through infantry improvisation and raw courage at a correspondingly higher cost in casualties. German forces had no direct equivalent to the Funnies concept at this scale. German military engineering in 1944 remained formidable in the design of static defenses and in some specialized vehicles, but no comparable program existed to build an entire family of purpose-adapted assault engineering vehicles specifically for breaching a defended beach, in part because German strategic posture by mid-1944 was overwhelmingly defensive rather than oriented toward this kind of large-scale amphibious assault. The concept behind the Funnies, adapting an existing chassis to solve a narrowly specific tactical problem, would go on to influence post-war combat engineering vehicle design across NATO forces, with the general principle of specialized engineering variants built on standard tank chassis remaining a recognizable feature of armored warfare doctrine for decades afterward. Assessing the actual impact of the Funnies at Sword Beach requires acknowledging both what they achieved and what remains difficult to quantify precisely. Casualty figures at Sword were significantly lower than at Omaha, and while several factors contributed to that difference, the availability of specialized armor-clearing lanes, breaching obstacles, and bridging ditches ahead of the infantry is consistently credited by historians as a major contributing factor, even if isolating its exact statistical contribution from bombardment, naval gunfire, and terrain differences is not straightforward. The psychological effect on German defenders is harder still to measure with confidence, resting largely on post-war accounts and interrogation records rather than contemporaneous documentation, though the descriptions of confusion and alarm at machines that did not behave like conventional tanks appear consistently enough across surviving records to suggest the effect was genuine, rather than simply a flattering post-war embellishment. Surviving examples of Hobart's Funnies can still be seen today, including preserved Churchill AVREs and Sherman crabs held at the Tank Museum in Bovington, and at smaller collections closer to the Normandy beaches themselves. Their strange silhouettes, drums, mortars, and bridging equipment still visibly setting them apart from the conventional tanks displayed alongside them. The beach at Sword has long since returned to ordinary use, holidaymakers and dog-walkers crossing sand that, 80 years earlier, was cleared meter by chains spinning fast enough to detonate buried explosives ahead of advancing infantry. Return one final time to that morning on Sword Beach, to the spinning drum of chains thrashing a path through a minefield, and the squat, ungainly machine behind it, firing its dustbin-sized charge into a concrete strongpoint that no conventional tank shell could have touched. These were not elegant machines. They were slow, ungainly, often half-blind, built from standard tank hulls bolted together with drums, mortars, and bridging gear that no pre-war tank designer would have recognized as sound military engineering. And yet they worked, not everywhere, not without cost, but precisely where they were needed most, clearing the specific obstacles that had turned Dieppe into a slaughter and would turn Omaha, a few hours later and a few kilometers west, into a near catastrophe. Hundreds of men walked up Sword Beach that morning inside lanes cleared by machines built for exactly that purpose, and a great many of them lived to walk further inland because of it. The tanks were strange. The men who built them were told more than once that the ideas were impractical. They built them anyway, and on the morning it mattered, the strange machines worked.